Mark, thank you very much indeed. I mean, the main reason I'm here today is because I was not invited to the wedding. But I want today to take the very topical foreign and defence policy issue, the crisis in Libya, and reflect on the extensive catalogue of European instruments, really starting in 1948, enhanced in the Maastricht Treaty, which we heard about in the previous lecture, lubricated at the Anglo-French summit at St. Malo in 1998, and then accelerated in the Lisbon Treaty with the European External Action Service, the High Representative, Europe's Foreign Minister, and all the paraphernalia of common foreign and defence policy, and to reflect on the disappointment, if not the failure, of Europe's foreign policy apparatus to make any significant impact on the situation in North Africa. Now, unless you were a Brussels political insider, and I don't know, some of you here might feel that you are, you could be forgiven to have been unaware that the European Union has a political and security committee. It's a permanent committee of ambassadors, that it's got at its disposal an EU Joint Situation Centre, a crisis management department, an EU military staff, which has at its disposal two 1,500-strong battle groups, and can call on a force of up to 60,000 personnel when needed. But on the day, or in the crisis that we faced in Libya, it was the individual member states who were left to mount the evacuation of their own civilians from Libya. It was conferences in London and Paris, not Brussels, that created the coalition of the willing who were prepared to confront Gaddafi's treatment of his people. But first, perhaps, a little historical background on this European security and defence architecture that I referred to, that we have created. And I will go back and give you a little bit of history and start on the 4th of March 1947, even before I was born, and you probably think I'm fairly ancient. But France and the United Kingdom signed a mutual assistance pact. It was called the Treaty of Dunkirk, and it was set in the post-war climate. It's a friendship and cooperation treaty that was openly targeted at the vanquished Germany in order to forestall any new aggression on its part. The French government sought to guard against what it still considered a potential threat from across the Rhine. On the 22nd of January the following year, 1948, Ernest Bevin, the then British Foreign Secretary, delivered a speech to the House of Commons in which he condemned the Soviet menace and asserted his desire to further the United Kingdom's cooperation with France and with the Benelux countries through a Western Union, as he described it, that would expand on the Dunkirk Treaty. The United States made known its preference for a regional pact going beyond mere military matters, and talks were immediately begun, during which the British government unveiled to France and the Benelux countries a project for a mutual defence alliance in the event of outside aggression. And on the 17th of March that year, 1948, the 5 countries signed the Brussels Treaty, establishing the Western Union, designed to guard against any armed aggression in Europe, not just from Germany, but against any of its members. The Brussels Treaty organised cooperation amongst the 5 signatories in military, economic, social and cultural spheres. A collective military high command of the Western Union, of the combined chiefs of staff, was created. But the Brussels Treaty was soon to be left actually devoid of its newly expanded authority, with a succession of treaties that were signed establishing the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, that was in April 1948, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation April the following year, 1949, the Council of Europe, created in May of 1949, and the European Coal and Steel Community in April of 1951. European Coal and Steel Community, very much one of the building blocks of the current European Community and European Union. However, while the Brussels Treaty failed to create a customs union, it did partially meet the concerns of the Americans, who considered that it reinforced the position and willingness of the 5 members, all keen to receive at that time economic and military aid from the United States. The 5 European signatories of the Brussels Treaty quickly realized that they could not repel an attack from the USSR on their own. The Berlin blockade that ended in May of 1949 clearly demonstrated that strong Western solidarity could prevent a tense situation from escalating into military conflict. The United States therefore urged its allies to enter a military alliance. And although the US Senate, jealously guarding its constitutional powers, would only agree to a conventional alliance, the US government was nevertheless determined to prevent and, if necessary, repel any communist aggression in Europe. As I said, on the 4th of April 1949, 12 foreign ministers gathered in Washington to sign the treaty establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which incorporated the Western European Union. And in addition to the 5 signatory states of the Brussels Treaty, we had the United States, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal, who all joined NATO at that time. In 1955, after a failure mainly created by France of creating a European defence community to sit alongside the European Coal and Steel Community, West Germany officially joined NATO along with Greece and Turkey, who had also become members a couple of years earlier. So from 1954 to 1973, the WEU, that was the Western European Union, played an important role by promoting the development of consultation and cooperation in Western Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. It permitted the integration of Germany into the Atlantic Alliance, the restoration of confidence amongst Western European countries by assuming responsibilities for arms control, and the settlement of the Tsar problem, which was the problem between France and Germany, the territorial dispute, which still rumbled on after the end of the Second World War. And between 1973 and 1984, the WEU's activities as an intergovernmental organisation started to slow down. But on the initiative of the Belgian and French governments, a meeting of foreign and defence ministers was held in Rome on the 26th, 27th of October 1984, and it was marked by the adoption of a reactivation, the text of which was called the Rome Declaration. And the work then started on the definition of a European security identity, and the gradual harmonisation of its members' defence policies were among the stated objectives. Ministers recognised, and this is quoting from the treaty, or the agreement, continuing necessity to strengthen Western security, and that better utilisation of WEU will not only contribute to the security of Western Europe, but also to an improvement in the common defence of all countries of the Atlantic Alliance. A ministerial in October of 1987 adopted a platform on European security interests. This was the Hague Platform, and set out the general guidelines for the future programme of work. The preamble stated, "We recall our commitment to build a European Union in accordance with the Single European Act, which we all signed as members of the European Community. We are convinced that the construction of an integrated Europe will remain incomplete as long as it does not include security and defence." And stressing that the security of the alliance was indivisible, ministers expressed their resolve to strengthen the European pillar of the alliance. So nothing is new about the European Union's defence architecture, and under the provisions of the Maastricht Treaty, this remains and has remained very much intergovernmental, subject to cooperation between member states. The Maastricht Treaty, which was signed in February of 1992 and formally established for the first time a common foreign and security policy for the European Union, created as a second pillar of the European Union, and therefore outside the framework of the European Community competence. That means not subject to direction by the Commission. The CSFP provisions sought to provide a coherent approach to foreign policy making on an intergovernmental basis across the EU member states. As part of those provisions, Article J4 of the treaty also set down a commitment toward the eventual framing of a common defence policy, which might in time lead to a common defence. Now, despite the inclusion of CFSP and its related defence elements in that treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, little progress was made towards achieving a coherent European foreign and defence policy during the first half of the 1990s. And while the US was keen to see its European allies take on a greater share on the defence burden in that post-Cold War era, many EU member states were, in contrast, eager to greet what was called the peace dividend following the end of the Cold War, and consequently they made significant cuts to their respective defence budgets and their armed forces. And by that time, defence expenditure in the EU 12 had already decreased to an average of 2.3% of GDP from 2.8% in 1982. And if you look at the figures today, you'll find it's now well below 2% across Europe, except in the United Kingdom and France, where it's just hovering around the 2% level. In addition, the intergovernmental decision-making nature of common foreign and security policy was considered to have hampered progress because of the divergence of national interests, and in particular among the three main EU players, the United Kingdom, France and Germany. And while the UK maintained a largely pro-Atlanticist stance, viewing the development of European foreign and defence capability as essentially a means of strengthening the NATO alliance, France and Germany were pro-Europeanist, or as my colleague Bill Cash, who's now gone, would say pro-federal, and strongly advocated the establishment of an independent EU military capability, largely in anticipation of US military reductions in Europe. And in fact, the EU's neutral countries expressed some concern at the development of a fully fledged European defence capability. And in fact, the differences of opinion between the EU member states in dealing with the emerging Yugoslav crisis in the early 1990s were held up as one example where diverging national interests had effectively undermined the credibility of common policy and hindered EU action on the international stage. So throughout the remainder of the 90s, sporadic attempts to develop Europe's military capabilities were made, including a proposal by NATO to allow EU member states access to NATO assets for crisis management operations. They're called the Berlin Plus arrangements, still in use today in Bosnia. And further revisions were also made at Amsterdam in 1997, including the creation of the EU High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, and the establishment of closer institutional arrangements with the WEU as a precursor to possible full integration of that organisation into the EU. But it wasn't until the informal EU summit in October 1998 that a shift in attitudes towards the development of a European policy, common European policy, was witnessed. And no formal decisions were taken at that meeting. It paved the way for two major defence initiatives at the Franco-British summit in San Malo in December of '98, and the signing of a letter of intent on cooperation in crisis management and operations, and a joint declaration on European defence. The core of the agreement between the United Kingdom and France was that the main security responsibility for Europe should remain with NATO, while the European allies would strengthen institutional and practical arrangements for acting together militarily in activities such as peacekeeping, where the alliance as a whole, including the United States, chose not to be engaged. And this approach formed the basis of the CFSP discussions at the Cologne European Council in 1999 and later that year at Helsinki. And significantly, decisions taken at both those summits saw all the former Western European Union functions being merged into the EU, including political control of what were called the Petersburg tasks. But one of the factors was to establish by 2003 a 60,000 strong EU rapid reaction force capable of mounting an autonomous operation within the remit of the so-called Petersburg task, where NATO as a whole would not be engaged. And as part of that initiative, the Helsinki headline goal was established, through which EU member states would seek to improve their defence assets and capabilities and address any identified shortfalls. Now, efforts were made to develop and improve on these initiatives, and at the Nice European Council in December of 2000, the presidency report was agreed, which was to chart the EU's progress in key strategic areas, including its relationship with NATO, the establishment of permanent political and military structures within the EU, and the development of the Helsinki headline goal, which included that 60,000 strong rapid reaction force. And since then, member states have continued to push for progress in security and defence policy matters. Shortly after the terrorist attacks in the United States, 9/11, the EU began to work on developing a new foreign policy strategy that would provide a strategic context for its action in the common foreign and security policy. And the final text of the European Security Strategy, which was adopted in 2003, identified 5 key threats to the future security and stability of the European Union: terrorism, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, regional conflict, state failure, and organised crime. The strategy acknowledged that in order to address these threats, EU member states would be required to coherently and effectively utilise the full spectrum of diplomatic, political and military means at their disposal. In this practical implementation of the security strategy, it has been regarded as one of the biggest challenges for the EU in its CFSP area. The EU's response to Iran over its nuclear programme and the success of the EU-led operation in Bosnia have been identified as 2 priorities for the near term. But a number of initiatives aimed at improving the military and civilian crisis management capabilities of EU member states have also both progressed and been established in the last few years. So EU member states have agreed on an intergovernmental basis the establishment of an EU military planning cell, a re-examination of the priorities of the Helsinki headline goal, the establishment of a civilian headline goal, the creation of EU battle groups for rapidly deployable operation, and the formation of an EU gendarmerie force, and finally the creation of the European Defence Agency, including the development of an EDA Defence Procurement Code of Conduct. The work which took place on the ill-fated EU Constitution, but then the Lisbon Treaty, provided an opportunity for the Europeanist states in particular to attempt to introduce additions to the treaty basis and the remit for common foreign and security policy. But where do we go from here? What does that create? Will we have a European army controlled by a European defence minister? I think as the debates which from time to time take place here in the Bundestag will demonstrate, that those debates authorising the German deployment in both EU and NATO forces, that no soldier from a European state is going to be deployed in a conflict situation without the express approval of his national government or parliament. So any talk of a supranational European army deployed by Brussels is, in my mind, extremely premature. Military force deployments in the EU will continue to be made, as they are for NATO and the United Nations, on an intergovernmental basis amongst willing nations. But the Lisbon Treaty created great expectations for the European Union, enshrining a new foreign policy setup. The treaty's key innovations, such as the creation of this foreign policy figurehead, the High Representative, Europe's Foreign Minister, and the European External Action Service, envisaged a new era of European diplomacy, guided by a genuine foreign policy chief, supported by an effective foreign service, and crowned with the gradual deployment of this common defence and security policy. The Lisbon Treaty's foreign policy pillar was, depending on your views, either a good thing or a bad thing, a progressive and necessary step forward for a European Union in need of collective clout in a new era of shared international challenges, or a regressive step for the nation-state whose sovereignty and independence would be irreversibly undermined. Unsurprisingly, the issue proved bitterly controversial. Opinions were sharply divided. Debate was heated and at times hostile. In my own country, tensions hit emotive heights as parties, politicians and commentators clamoured to deliver anti-Lisbon invective or sing pro-Lisbon praises. But whichever side of the fence you stood, supporters and critics were united by the belief that the Lisbon Treaty would radically transform the political landscape in Europe, and that the newly established foreign policy machinery would have a huge impact on the EU's role in the world. However, despite the fuss and the fanfare, the future was far from set in stone. Reality has yet to be tested. Would the Lisbon Treaty's institutional engineering really make a difference? Will the Union really be able to speak with one voice at an international level? And will it back up its talk with firm action? Well, a year and a half after the treaty was ratified, we're beginning to get some idea of just how complex the task of translating this vaunted vision into workable practice is. In the past months, as the violent unrest has gripped the Middle East and the crisis in Libya has escalated, the EU's embryonic foreign policy mechanisms were put to their first crucial test. The result, I'm afraid to say, was far from heartening. Hopes of a common voice, supported by a collective plan of action, were dashed by incohesion and indecision. Rather than crafting a clear, unequivocal response to the Libyan crisis, many member states reverted to their instinctive national positions. Even in the Security Council debate on Resolution 1973, there was no European solidarity. We had the unedifying spectacle of the United Kingdom and France actively promoting the resolution, but when it came to a vote, Germany sat on its hands. This was particularly frustrating given the support for the UK-France position here in the Bundestag, where I know that, I even was with the President of the Bundestag last week, who is still tamping at the fact that the government did not in any way discuss this with the Bundestag. So instead of deferring to the EU's CFSP mechanisms to help us bridge our differences and devise an operational solution, we've looked, as we have in the past, to the United States and NATO for both leadership and guidance. The Obama administration's demonstrable reluctance to become embroiled in another Middle East campaign has undoubtedly thrown something of a spanner in the works of supporters of military intervention. But any short-term setback hints at a long-term opportunity. Indeed, the US's reticence should reinforce rather than reduce the need for an effective European common foreign and security policy. In responding to the Libyan crisis, as we've seen, some countries felt at liberty to be resolute, but others were more cautious. The United Kingdom and France reacted strongly to Gaddafi's onslaught, announcing their support for demonstrators and placing restraints on the Libyan regime. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron was among the first to call for Libya to be suspended from the UN Human Rights Council. He also ordered all Libyan assets held in the UK frozen, and together with Germany pushed for the EU to implement a 60-day oil import embargo on Libya to cut off the regime's funds. And while Britain and France led the campaign for a no-fly zone and for all necessary measures to protect civilians in Libya, other countries, notably Italy, I have to say, I think it's fair to say, have been far less enthusiastic about military intervention, opting to focus on issues affecting their borders, such as managing the flow of migrants. Now, it goes without saying that securing sweeping unanimity in a European Union of 27 member states is not going to be easy. With the principle of unanimity guiding the EU's decision-making processes, I don't think anyone could be under any illusion as to the complexity of negotiating a mutually acceptable position on sensitive international issues which go right to the heart of national foreign policy traditions. Fashioning an effective response which balances individual countries' delicate interests has always been a big square to circle. But even the hardened realists among us were disappointed by that degree of indecision and even discord, as the EU's freshly formed foreign policy institutions became trapped in conflicting politics. The Libyan crisis stripped bare the European Union's fault lines. Internal differences have, of course, caused the EU to be flat-footed in responding to many an external crisis. We've been here before, but today's sense of déjà vu seems a little more consequential. The big interlinking questions are: why, after all the painstaking efforts invested in the Lisbon Treaty, has the EU failed to find its voice on the world stage? And secondly, does the Libyan crisis demonstrate the EU's inability to be an effective foreign policy actor? The answer to the first question was neatly summed up in a Foreign Policy Committee report in my own House of Commons, which a couple of years ago concluded reporting on the Lisbon Treaty that it gives only a bare outline of the role of the new External Action Service, leaving most of the details of its functioning to be determined. The EEAS will be a highly complex and challenging exercise. Indeed, the Lisbon Treaty's institutional innovations, while essential in facilitating legitimate concerted action, are only part of the story. We know that the treaty provided member states with a broad framework rather than a fixed blueprint for action. I think Sir Peter Torrey alluded to this earlier on. So this constructive ambiguity, which has graced many an international treaty, was designed to engender a spirit of solidarity, create possibilities backed up by capabilities, while at the same time allowing states room for manoeuvre. It's quite a balancing act. However, as is characteristic of many international agreements, the devil is almost always in the detail, or perhaps in this case, the lack of it. The difficulties start when the document comes off the drawing board into the hands of decision makers with contrasting agendas and differing ideas of how to proceed. The ultimate significance of the Lisbon reforms depend on the subtle and nuanced interplay of a number of factors. the High Representative's relations to the Commission President and the European Council President, the European External Action Service's exact scope, the Member States' feeling of ownership of the new service, the High Representative's skill to pursue a proactive agenda while gaining the Member States' confidence. I don't have time to analyse these intricate institutional details here this morning, but suffice it to say that given the highly complex technical setup, getting a response right is not going to be straightforward. But there's more. If we regard the European Union's key foreign policy mechanisms, such as the High Representative and the External Action Service, as the essential foundation upon which to build consensus and cohesion, we're still left with the task of having to build that consensus, and that can only come about through a genuine political will. Indeed, as we've seen in many cases around the world, a treaty ultimately can only work if the parties to it make it work. In the case of the European Union's foreign policy, we cannot be expected to act together unless we get our act together ourselves. It's for this reason that Foreign Affairs Committee report that I referred to observed that while institutional aspects are significant, ultimately political positions and political will amongst the Member States be more important than institutional changes. And of course, they were not alone. Many experts warned of national bumps along the European road to external affairs. Words and warnings are well and good, and we all could foresee the political challenges, and we all know that commitment and compromise are indispensable ingredients in any collective endeavour. But the reality is this: there are 27 member states. Each state has different traditions, histories, attitudes and priorities. Foreign policies are closely intertwined with the national interest, inextricable in some cases from domestic agendas. So how do we disentangle this conundrum? And more importantly, can we disentangle it? Many observers have used the Libya crisis as an opportunity to predict the demise of the European Union's dream of a common foreign and security policy. Experts have claimed that Europe has made no progress whatsoever in becoming a foreign policy actor since the dark days of Bosnia in the early 1990s, with some pessimists going so far as to proclaim the EU foreign and defence policy as dead. Well, fortunately, I'm not a pessimist. Recent events have left me feeling disappointed, even despondent, but I don't think the situation is hopeless. I still believe that it is possible not only to pursue a common EU foreign policy, but to do so in a way which complements national agendas. First, rather than dwelling on what the EU hasn't done, it's worth reflecting maybe for a moment on the positive action the EU has taken on Libya. We shouldn't forget, for example, the EU has already contributed financially, if not materially, to the evacuation of over 100,000 refugees and has sought to secure water supplies to Benghazi. For all those with doubts about military involvement, there can be no better example of the humanitarian objective of the operation. As the crisis unfolded, the EU strongly condemned the violence and the use of force against civilians and deplored the repressive measures taken against peaceful demonstrators, which have resulted in the deaths of a large number of civilians. Chaired by the Hungarian presidency of the Council, the EU Interior, Energy and Defence Ministers have met to assess the situation, while the High Representative, Catherine Ashton, established a task force bringing together the European External Action Service and Commission experts to adapt the EU's existing instruments for helping the countries of Northern Africa. And on other fronts, sanctions were imposed. A technical fact-finding mission has visited Libya to assess the situation on the ground, and the Commission has allocated some 30 million euros to address humanitarian needs inside Libya as well as in neighbouring countries. So coordinated EU action has been taken on a number of fronts. However, these successes cannot conceal the fact that overall, the European Union's response to Libya has been judged simply to be inadequate. The EU lacked clarity, cohesion and direction that make for credible and effective common foreign and security policy. So can we do better? I believe we can, but time is a crucial factor in this equation. We need to remember that the EU foreign policy dimension, even if we can trace its gestation back over 60 years, is still in its embryonic stage. For many years, the growing discrepancy between the evident success of the EU in other respects, such as the single market, enlargement, and the single currency, whether that's a success we were discussing earlier, its lack of projection in the foreign sphere put the EU's foreign policy dimension on a much weaker footing. Europe was too long introvert, defensively one-dimensional in its external relations, and focused on narrow, short-term interests. Often we failed to see the bigger picture. After the Cold War, things began to change. The Maastricht and Amsterdam treaties put in place preliminary foundations for the CFSP. Lisbon cemented those foundations, but there is no doubt still a huge milestone. But the fact is that no amount of institutional engineering can instantly remedy the challenges of the past. The Lisbon Treaty, therefore, like the preceding treaties, was progressive but still limited. It did not represent the solution, but it gave us the tools with which to build and, crucially, to learn. Indeed, when it comes to Libya, we need to bear in mind that the European Union has very little experience dealing politically in a collective way with this region. There is no acquis diplomatique there. The EU will need to learn from its mistakes in dealing with current events, and our ability to learn and adapt will, in my view, be a key to our future success. The challenge is to try and develop an effective common policy before a crisis unfolds, rather than after the horse has bolted. Here, the existence of the Lisbon institutions could be used to great advantage. First, the EU should put in place a systematic exchange of analysis and evaluations between national diplomats and the new External Action Service. This would help us to preempt divisions. Second, the service should organise exercises and crisis simulations on the main areas of potential future problems to detect those where European views diverge the most. In cases where divisions have come out in the open, the EU should adopt mechanisms that enable it to agree to disagree while remaining operational. The Kosovo situation, where there are strong diverging views among the member states, actually don't prevent coherent action. So that's a good example of where we can agree to disagree but still get things done. And that's where the Lisbon Treaty institution should offer new solutions for Libya and for future crises. In the short term, however, member states need to continue working to bridge our differences over Libya and start building an acquis diplomatique there as well. So in conclusion, if I might, when the Berlin Wall fell 22 years ago, the world underwent a process of radical transformation. We were entering a new era of global relations. We were fashioning a world which would no longer be defined by defense of our values, but by cultivation and expansion of those values. A world where the application of American power would give way, we hoped, to the projection of European power. The EU, it was hoped, would light the path to a post-Cold War peace and prosperity. But to succeed, it had to show it was willing and able to shoulder its share of global responsibilities, beginning but not ending with its own backyard. In 2 decades, we've made huge strides. We can boast numerous success stories, not least in the sphere of enlargement. But there have also been disappointments. Navigating the minefield of foreign affairs and defence policy was always going to be tricky. Foreign policy goes to the heart of what it means to be a nation. It is not only the pursuit of our interests, but also a projection of our own view of ourselves. And with 27 member states, each with a different foreign policy tradition, agreeing to frame a common policy was not going to be easy. But we do have collective interests. They are often best pursued collectively, with the full weight of all member states. The Lisbon Treaty has helped to put in place structured cooperation in a bid to encourage harmonisation, but it cannot impose it. As the old adage goes, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so it follows that national capitals need to light the way forward. It's up to leaders to make it happen. For this we need time, patience, but above all, political will. Let's not forget the EU is an ideal which has evolved through time, experience and perseverance. It's both a journey and a learning curve. And by learning from the EU's successes, struggles and even failures, it should be possible to plan coordinated approaches for future crises. Libya may have exposed Lisbon's limitations, as well as the lingering practical difficulties of enhancing the common foreign and security policy. But the crisis may well prove to be a serious opportunity yet. But I have to say, it is still work in progress.